some of the people we wanted to be here simply couldn't be here. The pandemic isn't over, after all. And one of those people is Michelle Bachelet. She is the former president of Chile. President Bachelet has served since 2018 as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she spoke in this pre-recorded interview with my colleague, Stephanie Flanders, the head of Bloomberg Economics. Please turn your attention to the screen.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know everyone here is going to be extremely interested in what you have to say, particularly about the politics and human rights issues in this region. But of course, given the headlines of the last few weeks and the big focus on what's been happening in Ukraine, I have to ask you about that briefly. I noticed that the UN Human Rights Council voted last week to deepen an investigation into the alleged human rights abuses in Ukraine by Russian forces. Do you believe that Vladimir Putin or Russian military officials should be prosecuted for war crimes?
Well, I have to say that we have had a mission there from 2014 that had been monitoring and reporting all kinds of situations and making a lot of reports to the Human Rights Council since 2014. And after the 24th of February, they're still there, working there, identifying and receiving a lot of information, allegations of violation of human rights, on how prisoners of war have been treated, if there are allegations of arbitrary killings or extrajudicial killings, if there are any allegations on gender-based violence and rapes. And our job as the Office of the High Commissioner is to get all that information, to verify it, to see what are facts that are real and which are not. Because in this kind of situation, we need to ensure that the information we share with the world, and of course with the media as well, are facts that are real. And also, but it's not for us to say whether something is a war crime or not. There is a particular, if I would say, methodology to identify if the allegations are a reality, and we do that. We are also asking to preserve evidence, because the only possibility of defining war crimes is on a tribunal with evidence base and, of course, with the criminal investigation. And that's why we are getting all this information, taking care of that, to provide it when it's needed. On the other hand, the Human Rights Council, they did, if I would say, appointed a group of experts on a commission of inquiry who will continue doing that job, to identify areas that could be able to hold perpetrators accountable in the future. On the other hand, the ICC, with the prosecutor of the ICC, they will do the criminal investigation as well. And there's also a third mechanism, that is the Eurojust, with Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine. They have also developed another criminal investigation that will lead to certain conclusions. But let me say something. We are in Latin America right now, your program there. And I would say the war in Ukraine is not a war that can be seen only as a terrible, and it is, violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. That is one terrible thing, and it has had so many casualties and grievances, etc. So many people had to flee the country as refugees, so many IDPs, so many civilians and soldiers killed. So that's terrible in itself. And we don't see clearly today how this will end. And we are trying to call for ceasefire and political dialogue and so on. But I have to say, because exactly you are dealing with the audience that you're dealing, is that the war in Ukraine has provoked and will continue to provoke a three-dimensional crisis on food, energy, and finance, as oil, fertilizers, and food prices are skyrocketing. And there will be serious effect in Latin America and in the Caribbean, already deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Price increases particularly affect vulnerable populations as they spend a larger share of their income on food or energy. And we have seen already, not only in Latin America, even in Europe, how inflation has gone up and prices are going up. So to protect the most vulnerable and often excluded, we need to think on solutions that member states need to develop. So we need to strengthen, for example, social protection programs. And the international financial system should provide relief from debt servicing and continue to make critical investments in sustainable development to promote employment and economic growth. Amid all these stresses, we could be facing a deepening governance crisis in the region. Amid low trust in institutions and political and social polarization, if we continue with high levels of inflation, with lack of enough food, with people having not any support, there will be a big social unrest. I'm certain about that. We have seen that inflation and high level prices of food in particular brings usually to a social unrest. So we need on one hand to think on how to be prepared for that and how we build back trust. Because there's also, I mean, when something happens in a country, but the leaders are trusted, that leader can speak to the country and say, look, we are facing this issue. We did not produce it, but we're having the consequences, and we're going to deal it with this and this and this and this manner. But if there's no trust in institutions, there's no trust in leadership, it could be much worse. So as I said, a consequence of rising oil and food prices is increasing social discontent and unrest. And we have already seen it in some countries. So we need to listen to the demands of the hardest hit sectors and people. The other worry could be the potential shift of investment back into extractive industries and fossil fuels with all the human rights impacts and, of course, environmental impacts that this could bring. And we believe that businesses can do better in this regard.
I think we can, and we will be thinking through some of those consequences that you've talked about, the collateral damage for many Latin American countries in the next couple of days. And I want to talk to you more about that. I think just briefly to go back on Ukraine. I mean, obviously sitting in Latin America, it has its own experience of being next to a very large neighbor and that neighbor involving itself in its affairs. The US has been very vociferous about calling for Russian officials to be prosecuted for war crimes, despite the fact that the US has itself refused to join or be bound by the International Criminal Court. Do you think that's tenable? Do you think that is a constructive contribution?
Well, I believe that the definition of war crime is not political. It has to be judicial after a criminal investigation. And that's what we will stand for, to have all the information needed to ensure that there is due process, that there are serious investigations, and that all the evidence is preserved. So that whoever the mechanism that have to decide, make those definitions, would have all the information that it is needed.
But if the US is calling for it, and yet the US is by definition not willing to have any of its own officials or military members be tried on the same terms, that suggests it is political, and that devalues the term, surely.
Well, there's a lot of politics in all these issues, of course. I would like that every country in the world is a member of the ICC. And that's not the issue. And we have 3 of the P5 that are not ratifying the ICC and the Rome Statute. So there is an issue there. And even Ukraine has not ratified the Rome Statute. But there are other ways anyway to investigate, identify perpetrators, and hold them accountable.
You talked about the risks that might come and the problems that could be exacerbated by rising food and energy prices in this region. We have seen a surge in authoritarian tendencies. Nicaragua is the most recent example. When you look at the region, which countries are you most worried about, and how do you think we can start to redress that democratic deficit, build trust, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, of course we have been following, I mean, even before the war and before COVID, we have been following several countries in the region and looking at their human rights situation. As you may know, these countries are like, we have been working strongly on Venezuela for a long time. And we have been identifying there which are the issues, the challenges, the problems, and also identifying which are the possibilities to improve the protection and promotion of human rights. I mean, if Venezuela has a good economic growth, that is welcome. It is key, though, that this growth needs to be used to ensure people can have an adequate standard of living. And I continue to encourage the lifting of sectorial sanctions to contribute to relieving the needs of the most vulnerable people in Venezuela. I do believe that individual sanctions can play an important role, but when you have sectorial sanctions, what it happens is that the people who are the most vulnerable ones are the ones who are affected because there's not enough money for supporting the health system, the social protection system, the education, and so on. The Venezuelan government has announced reforms of certain systems that are important, signed, like the justice system, the restructuring of the national police. They are promising steps, but they need to be implemented in a genuine and effective way to be able to address past human rights violations and particularly prevent their recurrence. And we are there in Venezuela to work on these issues. We continue to see some issues that we have been working with NGOs, with civil society, with families, and of course, we have been calling for the need of more open spaces of participation, of human rights defenders to have the freedom to defend whatever they need, and not the journalists, that they can have the freedom, etc., etc. Trade unionists that has been detained, that must be released, and the due process must be upheld. So we are in a political dialogue with them as well. I mean, I think we believe that the political dialogue between the government and the opposition is encouraging. And I would like to call the parties to resume dialogue in good faith and also encourage the international community to continue supporting these initiatives. I hope that the conversations in Mexico can be resumed. On Nicaragua, yes, we have many people have been arrested in the context of the 2021 elections, and these are extremely concerning. And we have been calling the authorities to release all those arbitrarily detained. The government has continued to cancel the legal status of civil society organizations and universities, and we have also called authorities to restore those status because those organizations have been arbitrarily dissolved or sanctioned. And of course, there is a new law that concerns us a lot on NGO, further restricting the functioning of civil society contrary to the country's human rights obligations. I think Nicaragua must remain in the international agenda. Last March, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution that allows my office to continue monitoring and reporting on the human rights situation in the country, and it has established a group of human rights experts with an accountability mandate in parallel to the mandate of my office. We are also being concerned about El Salvador, about the state of emergency, which led to more than 30,000 people being arrested, and the subsequent amendment to criminal law and criminal procedural law. I mean, we recognize, I have to say, I haven't been in office myself. I understand that security and how you deal with delinquency is a very, very challenging issue. And I recognize the challenges posed by gang violence in El Salvador. But we have to do things not only, I mean, the intention can be good, but we have to do it in a way that you respect international human rights law. So yes, a state has a duty to ensure security and justice, but it should be done in compliance with international human rights laws. Another country that I could mention is Haiti, if I may. There is a rapid deterioration of the human rights situation in Haiti as a result of violent clashes between heavy armed gangs, rapidly expanding the control over the territory. And this is very concerning. And of course, there are ongoing discussions about the future format of the UN presence and mandate in Haiti. And I think it's paramount that the protection of Haitians' human rights is at the heart of the international response. So much more needs to be done to ensure security, protect the population, overcome structural institutional shortcomings, and reestablishing trust in public institutions. That is fundamental if we would like to democratize and consolidate rule of law, including the holding of peaceful and transparent elections.
There's so many countries. I think we could spend 20 minutes on each of those, and people will be fascinated to hear what you think. But let me just come back on Venezuela, because many people were surprised to see you recommend the lifting of sanctions last year against Venezuela, despite there not having been a significant improvement in the situation. And I noticed that there have been 93 incidents that your office has seen related to restrictions on Venezuela's civic and democratic space just since last autumn. And yet you've said again that you are in favour of lifting sanctions. Is that because you don't think they are the right tool for Venezuela? And do we use them too much in other places?
Well, as I mentioned before, Stephanie, we differentiate individual sanctions, sanctions to individual people who you could think are responsible for violation of human rights and they need to be held accountable, from sectorial sanctions. We are against sectorial sanctions, not only in Venezuela, everywhere. Because what happens is the sectorial sanctions usually hurt the poorest. In any country, you could have an authoritarian government, and they might have access to money. They won't be harmed, probably, if you do certain sectorial sanctions. But for the poorest, they depend on the production of oil, the production of coal, whatever the country is producing, on the possibility of having access to health, education. I did this recommendation on 2020 on looking at COVID-19 responses. I mean, when a country have hospitals almost broken with very little resources, with few medical personnel and medical supply, these kind of sectorial sanctions were very complicated. But I have to tell you, when I visited Venezuela in 2019, I spoke to people who are not pro-government, and mothers and doctors of hospitals, or children's hospitals, who were affected by the sanctions. Even though some sanctions are supposed not to include medicine, medical supplies, there is a lot of overcompliance. Banks do not want to risk anything, and so they do not provide the resources for the families to have access to that. So what happened, for example, I was speaking to some doctors. They have these children who needed a kidney transplant, and there was no possibility to do it in the country. So they were sending these children to Italy or Argentina, but the banks won't send the money to those places, so they wouldn't accept it. And many children died because of that. So that's what I mean. I mean, when you are doing some sanction, you need to think exactly who you are impacting. And usually you don't impact the powerful. You impact the more vulnerable people. And this impression we have at many people.
The dynamic that you mentioned is very visible in Afghanistan, I know, and even despite the efforts to allow aid to continue to go through, as you say, people are very risk averse. Briefly, on the political prospects for Venezuela, what are you hoping will be the political solution? Do you think you can have a free and fair presidential election in 2024?
Well, I am a chronic optimistic, if I may say, because otherwise I will have to give up. Huh? I always use these words of Desmond Tutu, who used to say, I'm a prisoner of hope. And so I hope that parties will sit together understanding that they need to think on Venezuela as a whole, and which could be the best political dialogue to ensure that in 2024 they are fair, transparent, and very participative elections. And I hope this will be resumed soon, so opposition and government can get into agreements that can give the minimal conditions for everybody to feel that can be certain, and that can be a process that could achieve the result that we all want, fair elections.
You mentioned the challenges of office, and it's certainly better that you are conscious in your criticisms that how challenging it is to be on the other side, the receiving end of these criticisms when you're in office. We have seen new governments come in on a wave of optimism in Peru, Ecuador, Honduras, and certainly your own native country, Chile, and very rapidly lose support. If you look at the new president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, he seems to have lost support very quickly, and he's coming in trying to fulfill very important goals and hopes and dreams. So as someone who's been very much in that situation, what's your advice to him? How can he come through on that optimism that brought him to power?
Well, I mean, first of all, and I spoke to him that when I was in Chile in summer, I told him there has been so huge expectation on your government from enormous amount of people. And I have to tell you, Mr. President, I told him, big expectations can never be met because usually they are unrealistic expectations because people want changes, but in a month, in 2 months. No? And particularly when you are thinking on issues that need sometimes more transformational changes, not just a small little thing. I mean, you can have goals that you can do in 6 months, but many of the more transformational changes will take a bit longer. But on the other hand, I think they had to deal with issues that are very challenging for any government. COVID-19, still COVID-19 pandemic, the economy with the COVID-19 and the consequences of COVID on the economy and the employment, and now the consequences of higher levels of inflation due to the war. So clearly, I think for any leader, this is a very challenging moment. I think, and of course, there is other issues that in all South America exist as well, like level of delinquency, the security issues, and so on. My only recommendation could be always speak openly to the people to explain the challenges and explain what you're going to do to address these challenges. But on the other hand, to explain that there are no magical solutions. So I think the possibility of ensuring that even though you might not have an instant solution to this problem because there are structural problems, it's not something that you can just solve with a new law, or even if a new law is fundamental, it will take time to have a new law. The other thing that has happened, I guess, is all this process of a new Chilean constitution that's been going on created also a lot of expectations. It was good because the country through that has channeled the social outburst of 2019 in a democratic and participatory process, but also in something very interesting because it's completely paritarian. The 154 members of the Constitutional Assembly are 50-50 women and men, and that's really new, and it means that a lot of processes have included the gender perspective and so on. But of course, it has taken time, and people want solutions now, want changes now, and it will be until the 4th of September when there will be the referendum where this new constitution can be approved or not by the people. So I think they're leaving a lot of challenges.
Do you think it will be approved? Do you think it will be approved?
I hope it will be approved. I think it should be approved because, I mean, there's no... I haven't read the last document because it's not ready, it's just being worked out. I think it has a lot of good issues there, very important issues to solve some of the most important difficulties and challenges for our country in terms of ensuring that the whole regions of the country feel completely represented, that indigenous people feel completely represented, and how it can integrate better the international standards of human rights, like in housing, water, healthcare, and indigenous issues as well. And it's offering a new social contract based on plurinationality, legal pluralism, and interculturality. Some of the things sometimes for some people are not easy. I think one of the challenges that they have is to be able to communicate better to the people so people can understand what is it about, because some people are more concerned, of course, of working, having food, you know, the normal concerns of somebody, and not being able to get in touch in detail with these issues. But I think it's a great opportunity, and I hope it's approved.
You mentioned in relation to the gang violence in El Salvador, but there is a lot of violence and arson happening in the south of the country in Chile now between the extremist groups and the police. How can this young president handle that, reduce that amount of violence without falling into the kind of human rights violations that you've talked about in other countries?
Well, I think... as I said before, security is one of the main tasks of any government, of any state. It's not only the government. It's the state's responsibility to ensure protection to the people and to ensure security. And it can be done in compliance with humanitarian and human rights law. And of course, our office is always willing, if any institution wants to work with us in terms of ensuring how the way that they define their strategies, even their interventions, can be in compliance with the human rights law. So we have been doing that in other countries, and we have proposed, of course, to Chile if they need any support on this area, or the UN country team as a whole can help in many of these issues, that they can help the government to identify which are the main areas that can be through dialogue, but also through firm decisions that have to be made to address these difficult issues.
So we're going to run out of time, but I had to ask you one question, especially given your record in speaking up for women's rights. We've had big demonstrations in the US this weekend over the potential for Supreme Court overturning abortion rights in many states in the US. When you look at the continent, some would say the biggest or one of the larger democratic deficits that's opening up is potentially in the US, with the constitution there becoming quite a polarizing force. Do you think the US should perhaps take a leaf out of Chile's book and have a constitutional convention, have some kind of way to address this deficit?
Well, let me tell you first that the leaked document from the US Supreme Court does not constitute a final decision from the court. And I think that possible decisions taken at a national level in the US to revert more than 5 decades of protection of sexual and reproductive health and rights through Roe and Wade are very concerning. And we're really concerned at that because we believe it could be a massive setback for women's rights, contrary to the international human rights standards. Millions of women in the US could be affected by the decision, especially those with low income and belonging to racial and ethnic minorities, because evidence shows that highly restrictive laws have a disproportionate impact on marginalized group of women, in particular women living in poverty. Globally, unsafe abortion is a leading cause of maternal death, and evidence has shown that restrictive abortion laws do not reduce incidence of abortion, but drive it underground, making it more likely to be unsafe. Do the US needs a constitutional process? Well, I'm not sure there is appetite there for that. And I suppose the American citizens the one who needs to answer that. Because I know Constitution can open many other issues that maybe they don't want to open right now in the discussion. But I hope in this issue that that women's rights can be respected, because we do believe that everybody can have options, choices. And what states need to ensure is that women have those options. What state cannot do is to impose a certain perspective, but needs to ensure that all women, according to their own beliefs, religion, or decisions on their own autonomy, on their bodies and so on, can have access to all the different options. That's what a state should ensure, and not to try to ensure that some things are not available, particularly to the most vulnerable and poorest and marginalized groups of people in the country.